In our sermon this morning, we're going to take a look at some scripture from Acts. But what it reminded me of when I was reading the scripture and doing some research about it, I remembered my Aunt Nanny. And I think I've told you all a little bit about her in the past. My Aunt Nanny, she sewed a lot. And in fact, she made a lot of wedding dresses. She made all 3 of my prom dresses. But I remember when I was a little girl, we would go to her house, and so that she could reach me to pin the hems and everything, I'd stand up on her dining room table with the pieces of fabric and clothing there. And she would pin so she could later on sew and adjust them just to fit me. Now, I really didn't think a lot about it then, but it was nice to have something that was not a hand-me-down. It was made just for me. I probably would have preferred a trip to the store, but honestly, I really don't remember thinking about that part of it too much. But looking back now with the hindsight and a little bit more understanding of what's truly valuable, I realize what a gift it was to have those hand-tailored clothes. They were made just for me. Now, later, some of those clothes would find new life when scraps or pieces from them would be put into the crazy quilts that my granny made, and I still have one of those. My Aunt Nanny did a lot of sewing in the community, and she did sewing that required, well, all sewing when you're making clothes for someone, that requires, it's really a sense of intimacy. If you make clothes for someone, you have to know their size, you have to know how they live and what they like and what they do in their typical day. Maybe you'll consider their favorite colors or their preferences in material. Now, back in the day, Aunt Nanny was using, well, it was mostly polyester. And I cringe a little bit now, but that was cutting edge technology back then. But anyway, everything, when you sew for someone, you take them into account when you're sewing each stitch. So today in Acts 9, we find the story of someone who was very important to her community because that is what she did for them. Now in Joppa, there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcus. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At the time, she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples who heard that Peter was there sent 2 men to him with the request, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter got up and went with them, and when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. Peter put all of them outside, and then he knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then, calling the saints and widows, he showed her to be alive. This became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Now, in the study that we did of Acts last year, Matt Skinner, who's the author of the study, he talked a little bit about this passage. He noted that the title that is used, the Acts of the Apostles, well, the Acts of the Apostles, he claims, really should be the Acts of Peter and Paul. The first half of the book is mostly about Peter and his larger-than-life works and all the miracles, including this one, where through God's power he brings Tabitha, sometimes called Dorcas, back to life. And then in the second half of Acts, Paul is most of the rest of the subject. But in these verses, we are given kind of a rare glimpse into a more complete picture of that early church in the decades after the death and resurrection of Jesus. And all the people who were involved in, it was really a grassroots movement that grew the church in both spirit and number. Now, for me, one of the hardest things I've had to kind of reckon with, especially in the last few years, is wrapping my mind around the fact that The Bible is not really a history book. Now, you can find historical information in there, but it's not like a textbook we would use in a history class. The author of Acts clearly knew that there were other stories that were not included, that would reveal a more complete historical account. The early church grew not only from those few charismatic leaders like Paul and Peter, but also through the acts of those who were not in the limelight. Now, the story of Tabitha, or Dorcas, it's one of those stories of a quiet faithfulness, and it mattered deeply to her community. People on the fringes of the Jesus movement, they may not have garnered that much attention, but they were just as important that how we understand that first generation of believers and how we can see God moving in and through them. All sorts of folks participated in the first century church. They weren't all Peters and Pauls, and they weren't only men. Tabitha, however, is the only woman who is actually called a disciple in the Bible. She lived a life that was maybe more moderate and less flashy than Peter, who raised her from death, and Paul, whose words and actions form a considerable amount of our entire New Testament. But her story shows us a fuller glimpse of that time. God works through people, through ordinary people who build communities of support, people who care for each other, who share all that they have, their entire lives, their resources, people who worship and serve the community together. Now, the church that I attended for a good part of my life, they had this very special song that was often sung at funerals. In fact, I called one of the members yesterday to get a little bit more on the history of that, because I've never heard that song anywhere else. I Googled it. I couldn't find anything. I'm really pretty good at Googling and finding information most of the time. But whoever brought this tradition to that church, well, they must have been struck by the words, like I am when I still hear them. And here's part of the verse. Through the ages of time immortal, through the pages of history, God is summoned into service everyday people like you and me. Everyday people who walk beside him, always serving so willingly. I'm so thankful that God still uses everyday people like you and me. These words and this passage, they remind me that the values of the church, well, they're often at odds with the values of the world. If you'll remember in Lent this year, we spent some time on this topic, and we talked about loosening our grip on climbing the ladder of success and focusing more on inner nurture. What grows out of this kind of focus, well, it can be overlooked by others as maybe not as important, but Scripture over and over and over tells us that the things of this earth, well, they're temporal, and the acts of kindness and service, they're eternal. So a closer look at Tabitha includes her name or her two names. In Aramaic, her name is Tabitha. In Greek, it's Dorcas. This duality insinuates that she might have been bilingual. And we might surmise from that she was the kind of person who built bridges between different worlds, between different people, between communities, different ideas. Now, that would make her especially helpful in building up this new church as it sought to reach others with Christ's good news. After the group of friends, the widows in the community showed Peter the items of clothing she had made for them, it's a tender moment that he spends with Tabitha. Peter put all of them outside and then knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he showed her to be alive. Now, one commentator reminded me that this story is more about Tabitha than it is really about Peter. Tabitha's work is too important to die, and I am grateful that the story records God's agreement as well by empowering Peter to keep her alive. Now, back when I was trying to figure out what it was that God wanted me to do with this part of my life, I learned what a deacon is in the United Methodist Church. Now, I had grown up in the Methodist Church my whole life, and I only had kind of a vague notion of that word and what it meant. Between a classmate and a professor, I learned that a deacon in our tradition is an ordained person who is called to word, service, compassion, and justice. Deacons can serve in churches or in the broader community, but there is always a connection between the two. I remember being excited to learn that there was a name, a designation, a particular path of education and practice. Well, it was exactly what I was already doing and had been doing pretty much my whole life. I was the mom on the soccer field talking to the other moms about the stay-at-home moms group that I'd started at my church. I was the one who was there every Friday night with 100 adolescents that I didn't know at our youth center. I was the praise team leader looking for, introductory words and music that would help people not just be at worship, but participate in worship. Tabitha was never called a deacon, but she most certainly was. And I really think that most elders, that other ordained designation in our connection, they also function by necessity as deacons, especially in smaller churches. Ordained people don't just provide worship and conduct funerals and weddings and baptize babies. We show up each week to help draw that roadmap to service in the community, to advocate for blessing boxes and backpack ministries and medical mission trips, and volunteering at places like Christian Ministry. Deacons also remind me of good parents. Good parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, whether they officially have these titles or not, they help point children in their lives in the direction of being a contributing member of their communities. It's a lovely connection that this lectionary scripture today features a woman who mothered her community, who bridged the gap with acts of kindness and service, and who was so valued by the community that they sent Peter to be with them. And God worked through Peter to continue her ministry. It's important to note that even if she had not been raised to live on a bit longer and continue, that her acts of kindness, the very clothes on the backs of the widows in her community, would have paid testament to her service. She would live on through the example she left for others. Now, she was not a fiery evangelist or an astonishing leader. She quietly followed where God led her to do what she could, which was right in front of her, to build God's kingdom in her little corner of the world. She provides for all of us a picture of what we should be doing. Maybe it's not always big things in small ways, but small things in big ways. So friends, in the coming weeks, I invite you to dig into the scripture, to pray fervently, to plan with vision and hope, and to build a bridge between this church and the community around us. I don't know exactly where that will lead us, but I do know that without a doubt that we can all be Tabithas. We can all listen to the needs of those around us, and we can all be a light that points toward the one who called us. It may be something like what Tabitha did, sewing, that very personal one-to-one gift of making clothing for others, like my Aunt Nanny did. It may be getting to know those who are moving into our neighborhood by taking them a home-baked treat or an invitation to coffee or to worship and fellowship with us. I don't know about you, but I'm so grateful that God uses everyday people like you and me